Shots for inviting me. Thank you very much. It's a well-known fact that some elements in the Islamic Republic of Iran exhibit anti-Semitic tendencies. To better understand the rise of these tendencies, I would like us to see them in historical perspective and briefly offer some 4 factors as background to the emergence.
Excuse me.
Factor number 1.
Could you speak just a trifle bit slower? Because I listen a little bit slower.
Factor number 1 I'd like to address. In the year 651, Iran was conquered by Islam. The approach of Islam and Muslims for the Jews was based on various factors. One is Muhammad's attitude. I can say it. One, Muhammad's attitude towards the Jews at first trying to defend them, later attacking them, and extend you could read that. Extending to Jewish tribes. Expelling 2 Jewish tribes from the city and massacring the men of the third one. 2 Quranic perceptions. The Quran includes positive statements on the Jews, but also negative ones. 3 Hadith oral traditions and perceptions of the Jews, some positive but also often negative ones. 4 polemical literature against the Jews, including different arguments. A, viewing the Hebrew Bible as a divine text that had been abrogated in the face of more complete and perfect revelations. B, the Hebrew Bible as forged by the Jews. C, the Hebrew Bible was seen as predicting the rise of Muhammad and Islam. A 5th element, certain precedents that developed during the conquest of Islam and that were adopted by the schools of law in Islam. All above 5 issues are quoted nowadays, as we could see it in the morning, very much remembered, cherished, and taught to the next following generation. The Jews, as well as some other religious minorities, and this is important to keep in mind, were recognized as the people of the book, meriting protection or dhimma in exchange for the acceptance of certain conditions that demonstrated their submission to Muslim rule, the recognition of Islam's superiority, and their dishonor. The dhimmis, or the dhimma, consisted of a set of stipulations which included the prohibition of constructing new houses of worship, riding on saddles. The dhimmis were obligated to wear clothes that differed from those of Muslims. Still, compared to their status under the Sassanians, the status of the Jews improved under Islam. Jews now received protection dictated by the Sharia, the law of Islam. This is the map of Iran. This is the map of Iran in Safavid times. The arrival of the Safavid dynasty to power over Iran in the early 16th century marked a turning point in the history of Iran in general and in the history of its religious minorities in particular. Under the Safavids, Shiism became the state religion. In the like manner of Sunni Islam, Shiism viewed the people of the book residing under Islam as dhimmis. Nevertheless, Shiism has some unique characteristics in this regard. A hallmark of Shiite treatment of religious minorities is the concept of najasat or najasa, impurity. According to this concept, religious minorities, among whom the Jews were perceived as impure, whose touch defies the Shiite believer. This concept of impurity became ubiquitous and had a tremendous impact on the Jews' lives and daily interaction with larger Shiite society. It helped segregating the Jews and was used as a pretext for barring them entrance to the local marketplaces, bazaars of certain cities. Other issues are of food. Sunnis would argue that the food produced by Jews is allowed for Muslims to consume, whereas Shiites would argue that only specific items of food, such as fruits, vegetables, grains, etc., are to be consumed by Shiites. Another element is the question of marriage, whereas Sunnis would allow a Muslim man to marry a Jewess, for instance. Shiites would argue that this is allowed only in a certain type of marriage, temporary marriages, muta it's called, meaning which have a kind of inferior status in Shiite law. Indeed, these concepts apply to the people of the book at large, and this is again something to keep in mind, not only to the Jews. Still, Jews, like other religious minorities, are seen as inferior to Muslims, so we have to keep this in mind. Factor number 2 in my presentation. Moving from legal concepts pertaining to the Jews to the real life situation, I should say that the real life situation of the Jews in Safavid times, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, was usually very bad. Actually, due to different factors, not only Shiite perceptions, but also economic tensions and political reasons. By the end of the 18th century, in 1796, a new dynasty, the Rajah dynasty, took over Iran and reigned supreme over much of Iran. Under the early Rajas, in between 1796 and 1848, Jews suffered from occasional persecution and regular abuse, including blood libel accusations. At times, Jews were forcibly converted to Islam, as was the case with the conversion of the Jewish community of Mashhad in 1839. The Jews of Mashhad led crypto-Jewish life for generations to come. I should mention in this context a certain inheritance, Shiite inheritance law, which was very common at that time, according to which if Jews and Muslims are heirs of a person and this person dies, the Muslims take the entire inheritance. Indeed, all these persecutions, abuse, and laws apply to other people of the book at large. Still, in some cases, the Jews seem to be regarded as inferior to all others, and we have this quote here, which is a quote of one of the Shah's physicians' statement. The Jews are, in the scale of God's creatures, the lowest of white beings. They are the leprosy of creation. They are the degree above dogs. We kill a Jew and say no blood is spilled. They are the abandoned of Allah. Who cares for a Jew, more or less? Some change in the legal status of and daily situation of the Jews can be discerned from the latter part of the 19th century onward, largely due to foreign intervention. Still, Jews continue to suffer from disabilities after they were removed from other religious minorities, and this is a point to really highlight. Meaning Jews continue to suffer. Indeed, in many respects, they are similar to other religious minorities, their status, their position, the real life situation, but in other respects, they would suffer, and they did suffer much more than the rest of the community, much more than the rest of the religious minorities in Iran. In 1873, we can speak about the equality granted to the Jews specifically, but reality had a different course, and indeed, in the latter decades of the 19th century and early 20th century, Jews would continue to be attacked, harassed, cases of violence, attacks against pogroms, literally in the city of Shiraz, in Kermanshah, and other places. The earlys of the 20th century were impacted by Iran's first revolution, the constitutional revolution in between 1906 and 1911. The enactments of those years reveal some changes on the part of, for part of the religious minorities, including the Jews. The supplementary fundamental laws of October 7, 1907 opens with this following momentous declaration, quote, "The people of the Iranian Empire are to enjoy equal rights before the law," end quote. This was indeed a major break for the Islamic view of legal rights of non-Muslims. Nevertheless, other enactments of the same time period were less forthcoming. Only Muslims, for instance, could be ministers. Jews, among other religious minorities, were not completely welcomed into Iranian society. And indeed, onslaughts continued again in Shiraz, Kermanshah, and other places. Addressing the Jews' place in Iranian eyes, we so far briefly mentioned two factors. One, the attitude of Islam, mainly Shiite Islam towards the Jews. Two, the actual approach of Iranian society towards the Jews from the 16th century to the early 20th century. Both have a long-standing impact on contemporary attitudes towards the Jews and Judaism in Iran. Entering the 20th century, two further factors should be borne in mind. That's the third factor, the introduction of European concepts of anti-Semitism. A fourth factor is different political reasons or factors, among which the establishment of Israel, and I'd like to speak about the third factor and then the fourth factor. As shown by Sodi and some other scholars, secular nationalism was one aspect of Western thought that began attracting some Iranians already during the 19th century. Secular nationalism found expression in two different directions. One a liberal, The other was held by some intellectuals that highlighted the pure Iranian elements in their identity. Arabs and Islam that were seen as primarily foreign reasons underneath Iran's decline were regarded, according to this line, as Semite, whereas Europeans and their civilizations were seen as alien. The followers of this trend in Iran read the linguistic divisions of languages into Turkic, Semitic, and Indo-European languages in racial terms, which allowed them to dissociate themselves from the Semitic and the Turkic stocks, quote unquote. Such concepts found their currency under the Pahlavi regime. Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, was first and foremost committed to modernizing Iran, constructing railroads and factories, enlarging the bureaucracy, strengthening the army, and investing in the education, agriculture, and industry of the country. The ideology for this enterprise was nationalism. Nationalism came at the expense of Islam, and this was good for the Jews because now, much more than before, Jews were perceived as Iranians, whose religious persuasion was their own private affair. This process, however important, should not be overrated, as simultaneously the Reza Shah's regime increased the racial awareness of the Iranian people by emphasizing and glorifying pre-Islamic times. Some Iranian intellectuals and authors, occasionally under the influence of Arthur de Gobineau, the French one, emphasized the Aryan extraction of the Iranians, thereby asserting that those who are not Aryans, such as the Jews, were not included in the reawakening nation of Iran. Furthermore, the Iranian regime approached Nazi Germany. From 1936 onward, hundreds of Germans disguised as tourists arrived annually in Iran. German lecturers, teachers, and experts came to Iran to teach. Nazi lecturers were sent to speak on the supremacy of the Aryan race. In 1936, the Nazi regime declared that the Iranians are pure Aryans, thereby exempting them from the Nuremberg laws. In 1937, the head of the Iranian parliament, Esfandiari, even visited Hitler. By 1940, Germany's share in Iran's foreign trade had reached some 45.5%, more than any other foreign country. Iran became the refuge place for the pro-Nazi Meir of Iraq, Rashid al-Dayalani, and for Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem. By 1946, one expert of Iranian studies could argue that to some extent the Jewish situation was then worse than in the past. And indeed, this racist rhetoric could only invite pressure on the head of the Jews. Some anti-Semitic outbursts were seen. For instance, in Rash, Passover in 1946, in the northern community of Rash, a blood libel accusation was seen. Similar allegations were made in 1947 and 48 in Persian newspapers. Following the ousting of Reza Shah in 1941, parties came into being, some of them with racist tendencies and overt anti-Semitic ideology. I'm moving to the fourth factor. In the latter part of the 20th century, anti-Jewish feelings were harbored in addition to the above factors due to political reasons. The establishment of Israel on supposed Muslim lands caused Muslims at large, including Shiites, to get involved in the question of Palestine in all sorts of ways. One example is in 1947, Ayatollah Abu Hazem Kashani called upon Muslims to join their brethren in fighting in Palestine. There were growing Arab-Israeli conflict influence in other ways. The conflict was seen by some Muslims through religious lenses as a conflict between Muslims and Jews, Islam and Judaism. In this context, Jews and Judaism were criticized and defamed as constituting an old problem already from the rise of Islam. Regarding the teachings of the past as a role model, an example of the present, these Muslims read their own earliest sources, Quran, Hadith, and so on, in the light of the present conflict. As a matter of fact, the contemporary concern over Palestine, Israel, leads this branch of Muslims to distort the past. In reading the Quran, they would focus, for instance, only on verses that depict the Jews in a negative way. Even serious Muslim religious scholars, such as the late Allama Muhammad Hussein Tabatabai, well-known Ayatollah, who died in 1981, occasionally connect between the Jews of Mosaic times and or of Muhammad's time and the Jews of the 20th century. Following Quranic verses, Tabatabai deals in his 20-volume Quranic commentary with the Jews. In some places, it does not address the Jews, mentioning the Quran only, but moves on to offer his thoughts on contemporary Jews, thereby drawing a line between the past Jews' negative characteristics and that of contemporary Jews. Reading the present into the past that is distorting the past is demonstrated in the recently produced film in Iran, Yusuf Mayambar, the prophet Joseph. The story of the prophet Joseph, his dreams, his imprisonment, and later permanence in Egypt. In one episode, the sons of Jacob fight a Canaanite boy over his land. Jacob then rebukes his sons, stating that before the children of Israel, that is his own children, came to Canaan, there were in that land of Canaan other people who owned the land. This seems to be a latent reference to the contemporary conflict of the land. Furthermore, Judah, the forefather of the Jews, is depicted in a very negative light in this film. He's the mastermind behind Joseph's selling. He beats him up pretty severely, and he never fully regrets his supposed misdeeds with Joseph. At the end of the movie, the producers of the movie put in Judah's mouth a sentence that indicates that the children of Israel, that is the children of Jacob, will be called Jews, thereby making the connection between Judah's negative image throughout the film and the later Jewish people. What did Khomeini say about the Jews? Before the revolution, he used to say that the Jews were used to challenge Islam. From its inception, actually, the Jews disseminated anti-Muslim propaganda, or that the Jews want to take over the economy of the world. All these elements obviously are well-known anti-Semitic arguments. In his later statements, he made a distinction between Jews and Zionists. Jews are protected under Islam, he would argue, whereas Zionists are attacked by Khomeini. This distinction is sometimes, but not always, taken by Iranian officials. Now, as we know, we all know that the Islamic Republic of Iran is really anti-Israeli, the harbors anti-Israeli feelings and statements, etc., etc. The question is, what's the connection between that and anti-Semitism? I'm sure Professor Litvak is going to elaborate on that, and I'm actually using some of his own writings in this context, so I'll do it very briefly. Whereas Israel, like many other communities or countries, should not be immune of criticism, Iranian attacks on Israel are at least partly based on anti-Semitic arguments. For instance, the Jews are seen as exhibiting enmity towards Islam since Islam's early days. And this is what Khomeini said, and no wonder that they would do it now, today, with the state of Israel. That is, the regime would attack, or the Iranian government would attack Israel and argue that this is a kind of a characteristic of the Jews. They used to do it from the earliest days of Islam, and this is indeed a kind of an anti-Semitic argument. Let us move to really overt, clearly, in the anti-Semitic statements in Iran. So we have different kinds of evidence of anti-Semitism in Iran. In the slide, you see down, you can really see the different books that were presented in an international book exhibition in Germany in 2005 by Iran. One of them is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the other one is a book by Henry Ford. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion were published in Iran several times, in the 1930s and 40s, in the early 60s, in the late 70s, and in various editions since the establishment of the Islamic Republic in English and in Persian. The Protocols was also published in newspapers and publications. I have a list of these. Emphasis on the Protocols and the Jews' attempt to take over Iran and dominate the world is also seen, as well as to plan genocide, to genocide humanity, is seen also in an Iranian TV series called The Secret of Armageddon, about which I was informed in a certain memory piece. 2. Beyond the literature, some figures disseminate anti-Semitic ideas in their speeches and public lectures. Dr. Hassan Abbasi is an Iranian political analyst, the head of the Center of Doctrinal Analysis in the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, as well as a theoretician in the office of the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, and for some time in the past, an advisor to President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. In some of his lectures of recent years, Dr. Abbasi argues that various empires of the past were controlled by the Jews. More specifically, he says that the Jews controlled the Achaemenid Empire, as learned from the biblical book of Esther. Two of the most important figures in the empire were Jews, Esther and Mordechai. Dr. Abbasi emphasizes that by the Jew story in the scroll of Esther, there occurred a massacre, Rat Le'am, he says, of some 75,000 Iranians at the hands of the Jews. Holocaust Ya'aneh, he says in Persian. This is the meaning of a Holocaust. Abbasi argues that the Jews, Esther and Mordechai, pushed the king to attack Athens, exactly as they pushed the Mongols to attack Islam. About anti-Semitic films, we just mentioned briefly the film about Joseph, as well as The Secret of Armageddon. I'm not going to dwell on that again. A fourth element is internet publications. Following Ahmadinejad's rise in 2005, there are increasingly seen in the blog sphere Iranian anti-Semite blogs and internet publications. Some of these blogs focus on Muslim religious arguments and sources. According to Hamid Teherani, who did a nice job on that, some of these bloggers cite a single verse of the Quran. They love citing a verse that we already saw in the morning, at 582, chapter 5 in the Quran, verse 82. لَتَجِدَانَ أَشَدَّ النَّاسِ عَدَاوَةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الْيَهُودِ. You are going to surely find that the worst enemies to the believers are the Jews and the polytheists. And they love quoting this verse time and again.
The polytheists?
Jews and polytheists are the worst enemies, yes. Another blog finds hidden Jews and argues that Muammar Gaddafi of Libya is a Jew. He's responsible for the disappearance of Musa Sadr, the Lebanese Shiite leader. Obviously, we all know about this accusation against Ahmadinejad as being a Jew, and this is a kind of a medieval accusation against certain Arab figures or Muslim figures that one party didn't really like. Already in the 8th century, the famous Al-Muthanna, a Muslim writer, is being accused of having some Jewish origins. A lot is said against the Hollywood movies in some of these blogs. One internet article, I have it here with me, says that Hollywood Hollywood is in the hands of the Jews. It specifies names of numerous actors and producers who are, according to this piece, Jews. One blog says that Harry Potter books and movies try to give a positive image of witchcraft. The blogger claims that it may be contrary to it, that witchcraft is contrary to Islam and Christianity, but is attractive to Jews. Another blog argues that Mickey Mouse movies depict him in a positive way because the Jews were used to be seen in Europe as rats. So in order to improve their image, Mickey Mouse movies were produced. The fifth element, of which everybody knows, I guess, we have different kinds of government pronouncements. Following the line of some of his predecessors, most notably the Supreme Leader of Iran, Khamenei, and in common with certain blogs, President Ahmadinejad has emphasized time and again from different podiums that the mass killing of the millions of Jews during the Second World War, the Holocaust, is a myth. In November 2006, Iran hosted a convention that officially wished to examine whether indeed millions of Jews had been killed. November 2009, Mohammed Ali Ramin, a Holocaust denier, was appointed to Vice Minister of Culture. He said that the Jews are reason for the maladies of the world and that Hitler was Jewish. Most recently, in early August 2010, an internet site in Persian, translated to other languages, this is it, presents the Holocaust cartoons, which is based on a 2008 book of cartoons. I'm just concluding. To conclude, anti-Semitic feelings and imagery were not always common in Iran. 20th and 21st expressions of anti-Semitism are reflective of four elements. One, certain limited, specifically Shiite perceptions of the people of the book. Two, it's reflective of past treatment of and denigrating approach and imagery towards the Jews among other religious minorities, seeing them as filthy liars unworthy of trust and more. Three, it's reflective of introduction of European racists, especially anti-Semitic ideology. Fourth, it's reflective of political concerns over the fate of Muslim lands in their facing what is regarded as an imperialist onslaught on Islam. And it's also reflective specifically of political concerns over the fate of Palestine and Israel. Anti-Semites in Iran consist of some government officials, Ahmadinejad for instance, but also some of the adversaries from the protest movement. I have some names here, as well as certain members of society as seen in their blogs. That is, anti-Semitism is apparently a rather broad phenomenon in Iran. Nevertheless, not all Iranians espouse such beliefs. Some of them view the Holocaust as a fact, as well as reject common anti-Semitic themes. Thank you very much.
The roots of modern Muslim anti-Semitism, Jews, and the traditional concept of tolerance in Islam.
As a professor emeritus who is an absolute troglodyte when it comes to technology, I'm absolutely overwhelmed at everything that I see on this particular table. I would have settled for a simple lamp by which to read my paper, but I guess I'll have to make do with what I have here. Now, as I have had the course to remark time and again, there is much confusion that marks current thinking about the long history of Jewish-Muslim relations. What is referred to as Arab anti-Semitism, both within official academic circles as well as in the public imagination, is all too often the result of linking Arab Muslim attitudes and behavior with a vocabulary of ideas and actions more common to Christian Europe. The tendency of certain political leaders and groups in Israel, and even more so in the diaspora, if not in this very room, to reduce all anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiment and behavior in the Arab world to a single anti-Semitic paradigm closely linked to that of the West is at best misleading because it does not give sufficient weight to traditional Muslim attitudes towards Jews and Judaism. On the other hand, it is even more misleading to think that all negative Arab Muslim responses to Jews and Judaism, including patently anti-Semitic imports from Tsarist Russia and Nazi Germany, have been occasioned only by Zionist attempts to establish a Jewish state in the very midst of the Arab Muslim world, and that prior to the creation of Israel, Jews settled in Islamic lands always lived an idyllic life, and that they and their faiths were always enthusiastically respected by their Arab neighbors, so much so that in the best of times, the Jews of Islam enjoyed what has been described as a golden age, rooted in expressions of mutual acceptance and marked by tolerant policies on behalf of the Muslim authorities. Now, one could certainly argue, and with considerable justification, that Jewish life among the Muslims was, for the most part, preferable to that of Jews living among the Christians in Europe, that is, before Jewish emancipation took root in the more liberal nations of the West, beginning at the end of the 18th century. But the notion of a so-called golden age of tolerance and cultural achievement experienced widely by the Jews of Islamic lands is actually a phantasmagoric view of the Jewish past, invented largely by 19th century German Jews, seeking a model for acceptance among the Gentiles while retaining some semblance of their own Jewish identity. If one considers the broad distribution of Jews throughout the abode of Islam and the long history of Jews in Islamic lands, the truth is a good deal more complicated. The long history of Jewish-Muslim relations and the manner in which Jews and Muslims sharing the same watan, or homeland, perceived one another and their religions is a subject that has already been addressed here and will no doubt come up time and again in our discussions. A good deal also has been said, and even more written, about anti-Jewish sentiments sprinkled throughout Muslim scripture and other Muslim writings. What I intend to do in what is left of my 20 minutes is to turn to the very notion of tolerance and how it is understood in classical Islamic tradition, and, time permitting, I'll mention how current Muslim reformers, familiar with and admiring of European Enlightenment values, have sought to find equivalents for Western notions of freedom, pluralism, mutually respected dialogue, and the like in Muslim scripture, a quest which, alas, has not gained much traction beyond certain circles of Muslim intellectuals familiar with the West and Western audiences seeking a safe ground for a possible rapprochement with the Islamic world. As of late, those who live in the liberal democracies of the Western world, as it were a world in which religious belief has been buffeted by secularism, if not an outright denial of religious faith, the meaning of tolerance, originally indicating the bearing of a burden or the capacity to endure a dangerous substance, has been expanded to include putting up with actions, people's beliefs that one does not like or approve of or even vehemently opposes. One may therefore tolerate heretics even when intolerant of the heresies they espouse. Put somewhat differently, tolerance has come to apply over time the recognition that others are fully entitled to the free expression of their own views and the right to practice their own faith and or politics in accordance with their beliefs, provided that such views and practices do not compromise the codes of behavior that are declared the moral bedrock of our own liberal society. More recently, those who claim liberal values have extended the meaning of tolerance still further. They now equate tolerance with an attempt to avoid being judgmental of other cultures. Liberals of this sort are inclined to eschew moral condescension, especially regarding the most egregious displays of uncivilized behavior. For example, as a matter of principle, one can accept the various practices of courtship and marriage among different elements of our larger and all-embracing liberal culture, but one can hardly be expected to tolerate honor killings accepted as normative in other societies, a practice brought to liberal democracies by immigrants from abroad, or to choose a more pertinent example, in societies such as ours, one tolerates, indeed at times one even encourages, protest demonstrations against established authority, but not behavior which imperils the civilities required to maintain proper law and order, let alone endanger human life. The liberal ideal of tolerance today is the mark of a society that has more or less embraced a live and let live attitude, a view based most recently on a progressive view of history in which different cultures seek to accommodate one another in an ever-shrinking world, as if the moral guidelines of the emerging world will be in harmony with its economic forces as a matter of course. Responsible scholars attuned to differences that are caused by time and place are likely to note that current Western definitions of tolerance broaden considerably the semantic field of those Arabic words long employed by traditional Muslims when they speak of tolerance. Now, it may seem quaint that some scholars are still concerned with understanding Arabic, especially the technical vocabulary used to describe tolerance, but if one wishes to truly understand how different cultures perceive the world and one another at any given moment, it's best to determine what words used in common actually convey in the languages of these respective cultures. In classical as well as modern Arabic, tolerance is usually expressed by ihtimal, the preferred usage, or samha, samaha, and tasama. As in English and European languages, ihtimal, equaling tolerance, is the act of being able to bear a burden. For the great Arabic lexicographers, this included a capacity to absorb annoyance with someone's insulting or presumptuous behavior, and by extension, patience or forbearance with someone or something. By no means does ihtimal imply, as it does to modern Arabic speakers embracing Western notions of tolerance, treating those with whom one profoundly disagrees, or the views they hold, especially unbelievers and their beliefs, with proper respect, that is, without resorting to moral pronouncements about the parties concerned, while avoiding, as a matter of good faith, any condescending, insulting, or hurtful language. Muslims had absolute license, if not an obligation, to point out the errors of the unbelievers, and did so with predictable regularity. Samha, and samaha take a rather different route before becoming synonymous with Western notions of tolerance. Based on an Arabic root that conveys generosity, the semantic field of these classical Arabic words was extended to mean lightening the load of a legal obligation and acting in an easy and gentle manner. From there, we come to modern Arabic forbearance, and beyond that, to a sense of tolerance more closely linked to the Western sense of the word, hence the expression, Islam is the tolerant religion of Hanifiyya Samaha. But Samaha conveyed to pre-modern readers an altogether different concept. When Muslim scholars referred to Islam as Hanifiyya Samaha, they meant Islam is the lenient, or if you prefer, the flexible religion in Arabic within Muslim. That is a religion which does not impose excessively arduous practices upon believers, perhaps as distinct from the stringent demands placed on Jews by their religious authorities, a polemical theme expressed in the Quran. As regards leniency or flexibility in Islamic law, one may turn, for example, to various rules concerning ritual washing, an act required of Muslims before they say their 5 daily prayers. When Muslims travel in barren regions, as Bedouins often did, sand may be used to replace water. Similarly, when beset by sickness or difficult travel conditions, Muslims are allowed to postpone the long fast of Ramadan, in which they are enjoined to abstain from eating and drinking between sunrise and sunset to the following month, and one can multiply these examples many times over. The point is, when describing Islam as a religion of samaha, the interpretive fingers of the traditional and modern hands are not of equal length. As understood by traditional Muslims, samaha did not signify the toleration of other religions, let alone sympathetic consideration of the beliefs of others, as if all communities were meant to thrive in a free marketplace of ideas. To be sure, there are limitations to any analysis of interfaith relations rooted largely, if not exclusively, in texts written and read mostly by learned scholars, seeking to recover the views of Muslims in early times. Theologically grounded Islamicists tend to focus on materials in the Quran and its commentaries, on Islamic legal traditions, and on early works of Islamic jurisprudence. No doubt, some observers will argue that this treatment of tolerance and coercion reflects these theoretical concerns of religious scholars rather than the actual conduct of daily relations among different faith communities. But the sum and substance of these earlier discussions, which often expressed negative attitudes towards faiths other than Islam, was reproduced in more accessible literary text and filtered down to the general populace through an omnipresent oral tradition and folklore, which seemingly formed the conventional wisdom of the times towards Jews and Judaism. There is then ever so much we can learn about interfaith relations from literary sources, provided that we pose the kinds of questions that open rather than close scholarly debate. Above all, we are obliged to ask, what does the anti-Jewish bias, so well defined and so ubiquitous among Muslims, reveal about daily contacts and patterns of interfaith behavior? Put somewhat differently, did the anti-Jewish bias expressed in literary texts and oral traditions adversely affect relations between Jews and Muslims? And if so, how was this adverse relationship perceived by both parties? For example, can we really speak of Muslim authorities coercing Jews to compromise their beliefs and time-honored practices? Put most dramatically, did Jews feel any significant pressure to abandon their faith, even though early on Islamic law offered them, and also Christians, the status of protected minorities? Broadly speaking, the Quran was understood to prohibit pressuring other faiths to convert, when it states there is no coercion in religion, la ikrah fi din, an injunction that remains binding on Muslims until this very day. As forced conversion was in fact rare, it never was in the Middle Ages, nor is it now, an overriding and continuous concern for living Jews in the abode of the believers. The emphasis is on overriding and consistent. Interestingly enough, the Quranic pronouncement, there is no coercion in religion, was intended at first not for the Jews or for the Christians, but for Muhammad's polytheist opponents at a time when the newly declared prophet was in no position to impose his faith on his idolatrous Meccan kinsmen. It was, in effect, a concession to political realities of the moment. However, the revealed statement was subsequently applied to monotheists refusing to accept the legitimacy of the prophet's mission, namely Christians and Jews. Other verses in the Quran quoted by modern Muslim scholars to stress the inherent toleration of Islam, especially Muslim scholars addressing a Western world fearing militant Islamic revival, are Quran 109 to 106, the surah or segment of Muslim scripture entitled Al-Kafirun, the Unbelievers. The text reads, O ye unbelievers, I will not worship what you worship, nor will you worship what I worship, nor do I worship what you worshipped in the past, nor do you worship what I will worship. And then the oft-quoted line, you have your religion and I have mine. Now these verses are currently cited to exemplify a live and let live attitude which Islam allegedly has always called for with regard to other religions. Certainly taken at face value, a modern reader could easily conclude from the line, you have your religion and I have mine, that Muslim scripture, at least in this surah, speaks to a kind of tolerance trumpeted by liberal forces in the democratic societies of the West. This very surah was in fact cited by a leading Muslim spokesman in the United States shortly after the events of 9/11 in an attempt to promote Islam as a tolerant religion so as to diffuse the anticipated negative backlash against Americans of the Islamic faith. But these verses also have an earlier context and also an extensive 1,300-year commentary that offers a rather different gloss on Quran 109, 1-6, and what it meant at an earlier time and in a different world, and what it continues to mean to traditional Muslims in the Islamic heartland. Muslim and Western scholars are both agreed that these verses were originally uttered at a very early stage of the Prophet's career, a time when he felt it necessary to establish a safe space for himself in an environment that was anything but sympathetic to his religious views, namely the beginning of his mission in polytheist Mecca. Because the verses allowing non-believers license was in fact spoken by Muhammad and were thus God's word revealed by his prophet, they could hardly be removed from the holy text, but they could be subjected to inventive interpretation that contradicted the acceptance of the polytheists. The Muslim authorities urged that this conciliatory message in the Quran was contradicted by other subsequent revelations, and so they regarded it as an authentic revelation, but a revelation which was abrogated by the Prophet's later utterances, a reference to any number of verses that directly or indirectly enjoin the Muslims to turn and give battle to the unbelieving polytheists. The hermeneutic or interpretive principle in which the message of later surahs abrogated early revelations, in Arabic nasikh mansukh, was an accepted technique of Quran commentary. We might then ask how applying the principle of abrogation to the unbelievers, particularly the verse, you have your religion and I have mine, might have affected, if at all, subsequent Muslim attitudes and behavior towards Jews. Jews may have denied from the outset the Prophet's legitimacy, and they may have rejected his mission, but as did the Muslims, they believed in the one true God. In that sense, the original verses of the unbelievers could hardly have referred to Jews in the same way it spoke to the idol-worshipping Meccans. Once again, the Muslim commentators showed their interpretive dexterity, while originally signifying the polytheists who would not accept monotheism and therefore worthy of being subjected by force. The unbelievers later was understood by Muslim scholars to refer to Jews and also to Christians. That being the case, the verse could be applied to include blameworthy Jews of ancient times, the Israelites who disobeyed Moses and killed their own prophets, in this case a reference to Jesus by way of the New Testament. By extension, it could be applied as well to Jews who rejected Muhammad and his mission. However, current Muslims facing Western audiences wish to interpret, you have religion and I have mine, the verse hardly signified to traditional Muslims a blanket acceptance of others and their religious views and behavior, including monotheists who deliberately turned against their own traditions, as in the past, and deliberately rejected Muhammad and his message. Quite the opposite, when commentators explicitly state the verse does not prohibit engaging religious warfare with unbelievers, some authorities explicitly mention Muhammad's Jewish opponents and draw attention to leading Jews of the time by name. These negative responses to Jews and Judaism may be the cause of traditional readings of the case in traditional readings of the Quran, the ultimate source of authority for believing Muslims. It is possible, however, for new readings of Scripture to replace those of old, I refer to readings that might create a climate of greater tolerance, including perhaps Jewish-Muslim relations in the current world. That is, reading you have your religion and I have mine as a call for a live and let live attitude among Muslims and Jews, and indeed Muslims and other non-believers. A number of Muslim reformers educated in the West and familiar with Western ideals emanating from the European Enlightenment have criticized the rigidity of Islamic orthodoxy, medieval as well as modern, and have sought to move beyond the literal sense of Muslim scripture and its commentary and what they see as the interpretive limits set by Orthodox Muslim authorities. Like the traditionalists, they read the Quran as a God-given document that was revealed in time and place, but as God's word is eternal and changing times demand fresh patterns of behavior, they insist that its passages can and must be massaged to recover what one reformer calls the ethical legal principles embodied in the text, principles that may serve as a guide for human behavior in modern times. For example, as a spur to improve relations between different factions of Muslims and also with the unbelievers. Some Muslim reformers, largely situated in the West, have invoked the Quran, albeit often very indirectly, to trumpet the need for dialogue with the other. They call for a respectful exchange of ideas, leading to a sense of pluralism, and also call for freedom in the sense of living a life free of coercion. Some reformers also stress full equality for women. But the Arabic vocabulary they employ to express these liberal concepts, when found in the Quran and in classical Arabic sources, does not suggest the meaning that the reformers seek. That is to say, the values the reformers espouse are more easily traced to the universal rights of man declared by European Enlightenment thinkers than the Prophet Muhammad's declarations in 7th century Arabia. Now, the conservative sheikhs and imams, those religious authorities who command the allegiance of the vast majority of Muslims and are, needless to say, intimately familiar with the text of the Quran, its vast commentary, and Islamic law and tradition, draw rather different conclusions as to the meaning of the Prophet's revelations, a meaning which is more consistent with the literal meaning of the Arabic text and its numerous commentaries. Moreover, the conservatives, who now appear regularly on television and have talk-in radio shows and internet chat rooms, do not address an audience of Muslims that waxes philosophical. Rather, they give direct and clear answers to pragmatic concerns of Muslims wishing to fulfill God's command. Outside of certain intellectual circles, the Islamists or more traditional Muslim authorities have thus far emerged victorious over Western-oriented reformers who express their ideas in philosophically abstract English and French. All this does not bode well for those who proclaim the end of ideology and the emergence of a global village embracing all the peoples of humankind, peoples sharing universal values based on achieving a life free of untoward persecution and war. In sum, a life of tolerance based on mutual understanding with our shared values. I trust this is not a particularly happy message to present, but it's probably a lot happier than some of the other messages that are presented already. Thank you very much.
Our third paper of the afternoon will be presented by Professor Meir Litvak. It is Antisemitism in Iran, Continuities and Changes.
Okay, first I want to thank Charles for inviting me, and I also want to thank the audience, those who survived until now, for their perseverance. And I know what it means to be the last speaker who stands before you in dinner. In recent years, Iran has taken the lead among Middle Eastern states in its calls for the elimination of the state of Israel, in its espousing of anti-Semitism as an official state policy. Iranian spokesman, as well as Western apologists for the Iranian regime, often claim that Iran distinguishes between Zionism or Israel and between Jews and Judaism, and that such statements are merely anti-Zionist and are therefore perfectly legitimate. However, as I intend to show, Iran does not differentiate between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, nor is this animosity confined to one eccentric or particularly radical or hardline president. Rather, it is a much broader phenomenon shared by Iran's political, religious, and parts of its cultural elites. Moreover, it has acquired in recent years several new and disturbing attributes. I want to start here with a very brief historical survey. I will not repeat what Daniel Tsadik has said of anti-Semitism in Iran in order to highlight the new situation. Now, the Jewish community in Iran is one of the oldest in the Middle East, and many Iranians point to the famous declaration of Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE to demonstrate Iran's openness to minorities and to Jews in particular. Yet, there is this gap between Cyrus and today. Ever since Iran has become a Shiite state, following its unification by the Safavids in 1501, it has become the most intolerant Muslim state toward the Jews. Iran was the only Muslim country that experienced mass forced conversions of Jews, although some scholars argue that these forced conversions did not target solely the Jews, but other religious minorities as well, as part of Safavid efforts to consolidate the cohesion of Iranian society. While it is true, still there was a difference between Iranian policy toward Jews and toward Armenians, who were much given preference by the Safavids during those days. Now, these anti-Jewish traits continued well into the 19th century under the Qajar dynasties, and since it was analyzed by Daniel Tsadik both in his book and lecture, I will not repeat them. One element, this was Shi'i anti-Judaism in the 19th century, emphasized religious attitude. And a new element, which also Daniel Tsadik mentioned, was the appearance in the late 19th century and 20th century of the importation of European racist ideology, especially the element of Aryan superiority, which some Iranian nationalists liked very much, including Reza Shah of Iran. However, the reign of his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, was the golden era of Iranian Jewry, which reached unprecedented achievements both intellectually and materially. It was also a period of extensive Iranian-Israeli economic, military, and strategic cooperation. The turning point here, however, is the 1960s, which marks the rise of anti-Semitism due to the growing rift between the Shah and the Islamic opposition, which exacerbated Iranian Islamic animosity toward Israel for its alliance with the Shah and for its perceived essence as a Western imperialist base set up in order to oppress the Muslims. It was Ayatollah Khomeini who emerged in 1963 as the leader of the Islamist opposition to the Shah, who incorporated anti-Semitism with his overall political doctrine. Therefore, following the 1979 revolution and the emergence of the clergy under Khomeini's leadership as the new rulers of Iran, anti-Semitism became an integral component of the regime's ideology and political discourse. What then are the new salient features of Iranian anti-Semitism in recent times? And here I want to emphasize or focus on four elements. One is the modern nature of this anti-Semitism and the fusion of traditional and modern elements. The second is official state sponsorship. Third is the efforts of pseudo-academization of anti-Semitism. And fourth, Holocaust denial, which ties all of these things together. Now, the modern nature of present-day Iranian anti-Semitism is apparent both in media and the message. Pre-modern anti-Judaism was led by a powerful clerical establishment against the small and defenseless Jewish minority in Iran, with the intention of eventually converting them to Islam. It was manifested in various legal and social restrictions against Jews and was disseminated through anti-Jewish statements and interpretations in of Islamic legal writings, as well as in religious polemics against Judaism. Nowadays, Iranian Jews are not a target of anti-Semitism. In fact, they enjoy tolerance, though not full legal equality, in order to show that under the benevolent rule of Islam, Jews can live peacefully and therefore there is no need for Zionism, for the political manifestation of Judaism. The target today of Iranian anti-Semitism are the Jewish people as a group, as well as Jewish culture and Jewish history, and in particular, again, the political manifestation of Judaism, that is Zionism. In the past, anti-Jewish attitudes carried out a distinct Shi'i nature, manifested in an emphasis, if not obsession, with the impurity, najasat of the Jews. Khomeini himself, in his earlier books, before 1960, or in one of his early books, Tawzih al-Masail, that is clarification of questions, emphasized the Shi'i doctrine of the ritual impurity of unbelievers. Today, the scope of anti-Semitic activity may be unique to Iran, but the content is shared by all Islamic movements in the region and is clearly influenced by Sunni movements as well as by Arab countries. Thus, for instance, the Najasat issue, the impurity of the Jews, has been dropped completely today. The new approach fuses anti-Jewish elements from the Quran and early Islamic tradition together with those of modern Western anti-Semitism. It is based on the belief in Jewish enmity toward Islam from its inception and in the association of the Jews and Zionism with the Western cultural challenge and threat to Islam as a religion, identity, and culture. In other words, it reflects the anger of the Muslims, of the Muslim world vis-a-vis the West and the crisis of Islam in the modern period. It stems from the widespread feelings of a threatened Islam, which is a subject of a Western economic and political domination, and whose identity and culture are under attack by Western civilization. Islamic fundamentalism at large, Shi'i and Sunni, requires the existence of a conspiracy in order to find some external reason for Muslim weakness and dependence. Thus, according to Khomeini, the Jews and Christians conspired against Islam in the modern world, in the modern period. The Jews joined hands with other groups that were even more satanic than themselves, according to Khomeini, in order to facilitate the imperialist penetration of Muslim countries. Their main goal, Khomeini says, was the extirpation of Islam, since Islam and its ordinances were the main obstacle in the path of their materialistic ambitions. In addition, the West, consisting of Jews and Jewish and Christian elements, resists the righteous cause of Islam to expand to the four corners of the globe. Linking Judaism and Zionism, Khomeini maintained that the most overt manifestation of Jewish-Christian conspiracy against Islam was the establishment of Israel by Western imperialism in order to oppress the Muslims. Both Khomeini and his successor as supreme leader, that is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, stated that the occupation of Palestine by the Jews is part of a satanic design by the world domineering powers, that is the West, perpetrated by the British in the past and being carried out today by the US in order to weaken the solidarity of the Islamic world and to sow the seeds of disunity among Muslims. One of the major features of Islamism is the quest of authenticity, or the redefinition of Muslim identity, which intensified the uncritical and totalistic reading of earlier Islamic history. Such a reading led to the reopening and the need to settle once again various so-called historical accounts which Islam had with other religious and ideologies. This reading revived medieval polemics with the Jews and highlighted the sins and evil which the Jews had committed against the Muslims since the early days of Islam. Khomeini, for instance, charges in the first page of his most important political book, Vilayat al-Faqih, or the ruling of the Jews, he starts in the first page that from the very beginning Islam was afflicted by the Jews, for it was they who had established anti-Islamic propaganda and engaged in various stratagems against Muslims. Following this lead, Iranian religious and scholarly journals have published in recent years dozens of articles which discuss various aspects of supposed Jewish animosity and activities against the Prophet Muhammad. Typical of Islamic polemics in general, and this is something which Professor Lassner has showed in his earlier books, the past and the present are inextricably linked together. Thus, Ayatollah Imami Kashani, a member of the powerful Council of Guardians, created a direct link between present-day Israeli policies and Jewish atrocities against the Muslims carried out in the first century expression of the fusion between past and present. Past and present is the resort to early Arab or Iranian history. Again, the episode which the Tsadik mentioned, therefore I will skip it. A major modern feature of Iranian anti-Semitism is the borrowing of Western motifs. While the Islamic regime in Iran usually rejects Western cultural influence as an anathema to authentic Islamic culture, it has not hesitated to borrow anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish themes from the same West in the services of its cause. And again, the most blatant example, and the Tsadik mentioned it, is the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion by the Iranian government. Or another example is the borrowing of the blood libel, which was mentioned here today, to use against Jews in modern time. A second new feature of Iranian anti-Semitism is the central role of the state in promoting it through its various organs. Popular view in the West focuses on Ahmadinejad's declarations, but in reality, all Iranian leaders take part in disseminating anti-Semitism. To cite just one example, Ayatollah Muhammad Taqi Misbah Yazdi, the man who is widely regarded as the great eminence behind the ultra-conservative faction in Iranian politics today, stated recently that the majority of the centers of corruption in the world belong to Jews and Zionists. They try to corrupt the others and thus rule the world, and he added that the Jews are the most corrupt in the world. You don't find such tribe in any other nation, country, or region. Jews are the most seditious group among all human beings, and they will not leave Muslims alone until they destroy Islam. The official state media is a major instrument in the dissemination of anti-Semitism. Iranian TV, for instance, regularly broadcasts documentaries and drama shows based on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It also accuses the Jews of being involved in the September 11th attack on the US, and they could go on and on with such examples. The Iranian government has also mobilized academics to the anti-Jewish agenda in order to endow it with a pseudo-scholarly weight and respectability. For instance, Abdullah Shahabazi, former head of the state-run Political Studies and Research Institute, and who is a well-known historian in Iran, has published over the last decade a five-volume study titled, this is his title, English title, not mine, The Jews and Parsi Plutocrats, British Imperialism and Iran, which contains conspiratorial anti-Jewish themes and has been uploaded in his website. You can read it if you want. Also, the Historical Studies Quarterly, which is published by this center, again, this is an official state center, devoted the entire fall 2006 edition to Holocaust denial, including articles such as "Did 6 million people really die?" and "Truth-burning furnaces." Since 2007, more than 10 books have been published in Iran engaging Holocaust denial, while other pseudo-scholarly books, articles, and studies continuously uncover and analyze the history of Jews and Zionism in anti-Semitic fashion. Iranian academics have also appeared on state TV explaining in detail how Jewish rabbis in Europe used to kill babies and take their blood for ritual purposes. We saw this morning. A certain professor, Hashmatullah Kanbari, characterized in a TV interview the Jews as a subversive element in human history and as a satanic and anti-human creatures. He further described the Jews as the source of all corrupt traits in humanity. The political goal behind this pseudo-scholarly effort is indicated in one of Shahabazi's new books, which is called The Beginning and End of the Children of Israel. Finally, Holocaust denial brings together all the themes which I talked about. Iranian leaders have viewed the Holocaust as a myth invented to create a guilt complex in the West and forge a sympathetic public opinion in support of the establishment of the State of Israel. They argue that without the Holocaust, Israel might not have existed at all. Supreme Leader Khamenei, before Ahmadinejad was elected, said this line in a speech made in April 2001, which maintained that the Zionists had exaggerated Nazi crimes against European Jewry in order to solicit international support for the establishment of the Zionist entity in 1948. Hence, the premise which stands behind the denial was that the refutation of this lie would undermine Israel's legitimacy and eventually would bring its collapse. The instrumentalist usage of Iranian Holocaust denial is also evident in the frequent comparison by Iranian officials and media between Zionism and Nazism, and between the Gestapo-like policies of Israel and those of Hitler, and vice versa. By the way, it can also be instrumentalization, because sometimes they deny the Holocaust, and occasionally they accuse the Zionist movement of collaborating with the Nazis in killing the Jews. Holocaust denial is in fact anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism. To cite just one example, former president and current head of Iran's Assembly of Experts, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who was, until recently, the second most powerful person in the Iranian regime, and who is often hailed as a moderate in Iranian politics, compared to Ahmadinejad as a moderate, explained in a speech commemorating Jerusalem Day in October 2007 that the Nazis' first objective was to free Europe from the evils of Zionism, and that this was justifiable because the Zionists, who constituted a strong political party in Europe, caused much disorder there. Since the Zionists had a lot of property and controlled an empire of propaganda, they made European governments helpless, and what Hitler and the Nazis did to the Jews of Europe, he added, was partly due to these circumstances with the Jews. They wanted to expel the Zionists from Europe because they had always had this great, the Zionists were such a great menace to the governments there. The first goal was to save Europe from the evils of Zionism, and in this way, they have been relatively successful. In using the pretext of Zionist fabrication of the Holocaust, Iran distorts and denies Jewish history and deprives the Jews of their human dignity by presenting the worst tragedy as a scam, even though both have nothing to do with Zionism and Israel per se. The very claim of Zionist invention of the Holocaust appeals to strong sentiments existing both in European and Middle Eastern anti-Semitism that emphasizes Jewish unscrupulous machinations in order to advance illegitimate and immoral goals, mainly financial extortion. It aims at demolishing the legitimacy of the Jewish state, which they claim is based on the Holocaust myth. As such, it is in tune with anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist sentiments in Europe, which argue that the Jews had forfeited their right or the status of victims by victimizing the Palestinians, and that Israel does not have the right to exist because the human price of its existence is too high. Now, while Iran professes to be anti-Nazi, both Holocaust denial and the equation of Zionism with the Nazis minimizes the extent and depth of Nazi evil and brutality, thereby serving the cause of Western neo-Nazis and other anti-Semites. In a similar vein, the vilification of Zionists as Nazis is intended to humiliate the Jews as the most act-sensitive and painful feeling by equating them with their worst tormentors. Moreover, not only does it deprive the Jews of their dignity and transforms the victims into perpetrators of the crime, it threatens the Jews with the same ultimate fate of the Nazis, that is destruction. To conclude, anti-Semitism in Iran has undergone significant changes in recent decades, but unfortunately, it is in the wrong direction. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure, Charles, do we have time for questions, or have we run over? We are over, so thank you very much for your participation. And thank you.